So, greetings everyone. My name is Mykhaylo Yakubovych. I'm representing Global Qur'an project, and we are continuing our Global Qur'an Conversation Talk series. Already the second one, starting a very long way, and hope to see you also on our next talks. So today we have Sheam Abdul Aziz Khan. She's a PhD candidate at Cardiff University Center for the Study of Islam in the UK. She holds a Master in Quranic Studies and Exegesis from Qatar University College of Sharia and BA in Islamic Studies from Princess Noura University in Riyadh. And her topic is Lost in Trauma, Exploring Ideological Influences Present in Quran Translation through the lens of phenomenology and trauma theory. Before giving the floor to our speaker, I just would like to remind that we have around 40 minutes of our talk and then an opportunity to share thoughts, commenting, questioning, and actually discussing everything which is going to be said in that wonderful talk, I believe. So, Sheam, the floor is yours. You're welcome.
Hello and assalamu alaikum and welcome to everyone. And I'm deeply honored to be invited to speak as part of the Global Conversations talk series on Quran translation. Thank you to Professor Pink for inviting me and to Mykhaylo for introducing me with such a generous introduction. So as you can see, my talk, I've entitled it Lost in Trauma. This is something, obviously it's a pun on Lost in Translation. I'm not going to be taking you down to Tokyo, but we will be exploring ideological influences present in Quran translation through the lens of trauma theory. Now, when it comes to Quran translation in general, then we know that all of you are probably familiar with the work that Professor Pink and the Global team have been doing. So they have covered a number of translations of the Quran in different languages. So I'm not going to be speaking about, translation in general or translation of the Quran, but what I'm talking about is something quite specific, and that is to do with the actually, I think my thing is jammed. Oh dear. Is it changing?
Yes.
Okay, great. On my side, I should have apologized at the beginning, but it's coincided with my trip where I'm in Cairo. So for some reason I have very slow internet. So I'm hoping my voice will go through and the slides will change in time. It seems that they are changing, but on my side, they're not changing as much. So apologies for that. So the key elements that I'm looking at are Quran translation, ideology in Quran translation, and the trauma theory. This is something that when we look at it all together, it seems like how can trauma be relevant to this debate when we're talking about translating directly from the Quran. But if I take a step back and we look at, first of all, the relationship between the growth of the Muslim population worldwide, the global population, and the native Arabic speakers, it kind of puts into context why this is becoming such a popular route for somebody to get their ideas out. Because as you can see, that the number of Muslims globally are increasing, decade upon decade. And even though the number of Arabic speakers are increasing, the percentage or the ratio by which they increase is nowhere near keeping up with the growth in Muslims who want to access their text, what they consider to be their sacred text. This creates this huge vacuum where translations are depended on. And although we recognize in translation studies that, and also, in Islamic studies in general, it's understood that the translation of the Quran is not considered to be the Quran. This is something that on the ground, in real terms, that is what people are depending on, because they do not have any other way to access their sacred text. So the only medium by which they can access it is a translation. And this gives a lot of power to somebody who manages to put out a well distributed translation. And there isn't exactly, it's not always congruent between how good the translation is and how popular it becomes, because sometimes it is to do with how well it is distributed, the publishing house that is used, and certain other elements. There was a survey that was done a few years ago about how people choose their translation. And it was quite surprising that the majority of people that were asked in that survey, it was 70 odd people, some of them quite learned, some of them from different walks of life, and some of them even imams who use translations in their khutbahs. Most of them were speaking about easy English. This was obviously translations of the Quran in English. They were speaking about easy English. They were speaking about, they liked the way it was set out, if it had the Arabic and the English. They even spoke about the quality of the paper, for example. But nobody really spoke about the background of the translator who is translating the text. So, we can say that this in many ways has been seen and can be seen as a shortcut to get one's own reading of the Quran into the public sphere, because translations of the Quran do not require any previous, there is not a, it's not like becoming a sheikh or a scholar that you're asked to have this many years of traditional training or anything like that. And you will find that in many cases, translators of the Quran have not actually even learnt the Arabic, and it's taken from a number of other translations. So it is, I won't call it a shortcut because it is still tedious work, but it is one of the ways that people have been able to get their understanding of the Quran out into the mainstream. This provides us with a very unique situation where the target audience is, I'll take it back there for a second. The target audience is what we would call an unassuming audience. The reception theory, when we look at it with regards to the Quran, that the majority of people who are reading their translation of the Quran, they are hoping to get a translation of what they consider to be God's words. Okay, what they consider to be their sacred text, and there isn't really any detective work going on, any investigation going on as to who is this translator, and there seems to be quite a lack of curiosity as well amongst the target audience with regards to this. If we look at ideology in translation in general, it begs the question how ideology is considered in discourse in general. And this is something that, when you look at it, you find that a lot of scholars have written about this. So we find, for example, Van Dyck mentions that few of us in the West or elsewhere describe our own belief systems or convictions as ideologies. On the contrary, ours is the truth, theirs is the ideology. This is important because many times when we find translators of the Quran saying, my translation does not include any ideology, it's something that is free of my personal beliefs. It's not always, they cannot always be accused of trying to mislead the people, but it's just the way it is that a person, when they're putting their thoughts out, they don't consider their own ideas to be an ideology. They consider everybody else, that's an ideology. This is just the understanding of the Quran. MacDonald mentions how all discourses are ideologically positioned, none are neutral. And Aishel mentions how no translation is ever complete. The selection of possible meanings to be excluded or included are always ideological. And this is something we're going to come to later on when we discuss the trauma side of things and the trauma theory side of things, that it's not just what's included, but it's also that which is excluded can be an ideological choice. This is something that we see again and again. So Schaffner, he mentions that the process of translation is usually affected by the translator's ideology and will affect the selection of the words in the target text. What's interesting to me is probably the next point, which is what we were discussing about the unassuming audience, where Van Dijk mentions that ideological communication may be most effective when recipients do not or hardly expect ideological implications. He actually gives the example of children's stories. So he mentions children's textbooks, children's stories, and even TV news. And we're obviously talking about the pre-Trump era when it wasn't so much fake news out there, or at least it wasn't something that was discussed on mainstream media, that news can be fake as well. So his writing at this point, we can see he's written in 1998, is discussing prior to this era of the fake news phenomenon. And he mentions that when people listen to the news, or when children, children's stories are being read, ideology is not generally something that is being implicated. And for that reason, it is the easiest way to communicate that ideology and make those assertions, because it is least expected at that point. Now, this takes us to how sacred texts, in particular, the Quran, fall within this category that Van Dijk is discussing, although he doesn't obviously mention it, that somebody who's reading a translation of the Quran, many times when you discuss them, and you see this through the surveys as well, the thing that comes about is, well, this is just the language coming, this is just the meanings of the words of God coming from one language into the other. And this is kind of, the translators kind of lean into this, and we find the publishing houses lean into this as well. And you find, I'll mention a few quotes. You find different translators mentioning how their translation is free of any type of doctrinal bias. So we have Lale Bakhtiyar, who we'll speak about more later on. She mentions, my translation is free from any transient, denominational, or doctrinal bias. It is the most objective type of translation. We find Dalal Itani saying, this is a translation that says exactly what the Arabic says with the same clarity, yet in the English language. And here he's making a point of saying there is no difference. It's the same as what is in the Arabic, it's just in the English. Okay. And then we find in one of the more recent translations, Mykhaylo's translation, which came out in 2022, he mentions, everything found on each page represents the meaning and intention of its divine author, whether explicitly or implicitly, in connotation, nuance, or context. So you can't really blame the target audience for coming to the conclusion that, okay, there is nothing from the ideology of the translator coming through. And what we're going to do is try and, if I take it back a little bit, divide the translations out there into two categories, that those who claim to be free of ideology, which are like the ones that I mentioned, that was just a snapshot of some of the translations out there that claim to be free of ideology, and those who do not claim to be free of ideology. And the ones that we're speaking about are the second category, the category that claim to be free of ideology. They generally are divided as tafsir-based translation, those who say that we're looking at so many different types of tafsir from all of the different schools, therefore we cannot possibly be following one type of belief system or ideology. And those who say that we're following the dictionary-based translation, we're literally taking words, looking them in the dictionary, and therefore, how can this be ideological? It's just purely linguistics. So the example of a tafsir-based translation that we mentioned that claims to be ideology-free is that of the Qur'an Beheld by Mykhaylo, and there's many more. And the example of the one that's a dictionary-based translation, where the translator, Lale Bakhtiyar, mentions that she's just doing a simple word-to-word translation, how can this be ideological? So this is just a background understanding of how the different translations work with regards to ideology. When we come to looking at the translator, it's important to recognize, and Lefebvre mentions this, that, that the translator is first a reader and then he is a rewriter. So first it is his or her reading of the Quran. They become the source text decoder. And then as this reader, after they have read it and consumed this, they become the source, the target text producer. And that is the rewriting of the text. And that is how, like any other text, you get the Quran translation. This takes us to the concept and understanding of unconscious ideological influences, because we've got those that may be inserted intentionally, and that's a whole separate talk. And for me, a whole separate chapter when we're talking about ideological interpolations that are done on purpose. But what interests me and what I want to discuss today is the unconscious ideological influences, which Wales mentions. It is often the unconscious ideological influences that are the most influential on the translator's choices. Now, this is something that it's important to understand, because that many times the translator will say, well, I haven't put any ideology in. This is not something, I have tried to be as faithful to the text as is possible. But as Robinson mentions, translators tend to let their knowledge and their previous experience, which is ultimately ideological and governed by ideological norms, control their performance when they are translating. And this is something that is just considered the human experience. The ideology will have been shaped through the duration of the translator's life. And it's not always possible to exactly pinpoint at which point they picked up a certain thought process or a certain belief system. And for this reason, no two translators will read the text in an identical fashion. And consequently, no two translators will then be expected to produce an identical translation of any text. The differences, Robinson mentions, the differences are based on the fabric of their life experiences and the learning that they went through, which is woven together with their ideology. In fact, what bridges the gap, he observes, between the different individual interpretations, what bridges this gap of the source text is their shared background. So you will find the shared background of two translators sometimes will bridge this gap more than any other external factor that can be there. So it can therefore be concluded, it can therefore be concluded that translators produce translations that are influenced by their own personal reading of the source text. And this is based on the translator's previous knowledge, their previous experience, and a whole series of other things. So here, for example, I've just thrown some things together on the slide just so that you can follow along when I'm explaining that what is influencing a Quran translator's choices. Okay, what is this unconscious side of what is impacting the choices that a translator is selecting. Now you have the cultural context, whether that's where they were brought up, whether it was, whether it was in a colonial context, whether it was a decolonial context, whether, what was the media they consumed, what was, even what were the cartoons did they grow up, reading, what are the stories that they read, what are the books they studied in school. That is the cultural context with which they grew up. Okay, that is something that cannot be removed from the mind when they're now looking at the text as a reader. And that's why two people will never read the text identically. Then you have the academic genealogy, their mentors, their teachers, their places of study, what knowledge have they consumed, the ideological positionality, are they traditionalists? Are they going to look into the corpus of traditional exegetical material, or is that something that they will not be looking at? Do they have a Quranist view? Do they have a feminist view? Will they look at hadith? So that's the ideological positionality. Going back to the top of the left side of the spokes, you have the theological leanings, the sectarian bias, where there's Ahmadi, Salafi, Sufi, Shi'i, Sunni, and this is something they're perhaps a little bit more aware of. Likewise, their methodological choices, formal versus dynamic equivalence, are they trying to make it a literal translation, or are they trying to go for a sense for sense translation of the book in terms of their exegetical interpretation, or is it purely linguistic? Then right at the bottom, we have the personal context, and that's what the rest of my talk today is going to be. The lived experience, whether there was trauma, were there global events that colored their understanding of a sacred text. If you look at those who lived through 9/11, for example, or lived through certain global events that would color their view of what a religion or what a particular text is to say, or how they want to communicate what those verses are saying. Some of them will be intentional, but many times it'll be a reading that is there that they themselves are also unaware of. I'm giving the example next of Bakhtiar. I'll come back to those folks in a moment, but I wanted to mention her translation specifically because it's a very good case study of looking at what can be considered a traumatized reader. So I'm going to briefly maybe take you through some aspects of her life so that it becomes, so you've got an idea of who we're talking about and what she went through. And then after that, we'll go back to look at how trauma theory fits in with what she said. So with Bakhtiar, you have somebody who, first of all, has put out a lot of autobiographical material. She speaks about her life. She speaks about her father, her mother, and her father. As you can see in the left picture, that's her father and her mother. And she speaks about her marriage life. And she's very aware that she has been branded as a feminist translator, and people may accuse her of having an unhappy marital life or of having negative experiences with men. So we find that Bakhtiar goes out of her way to mention it in her autobiographical material how she has always been really happy and all of her personal interactions with men were very good, and there was nothing there that would cause her to be unhappy. Briefly, if we look at what's there, if I take you back, we find that if we start at the top, her father, who was Iranian and had come to the US, according to her, he was illiterate until the age of 46, and then he was picked out of, by somebody who was a teacher in one of the Iranian schools, and was given this amazing opportunity to learn English over 2 years. And then he received a scholarship to Columbia. I'm still waiting for Columbia to get back to me with regards to confirming this, but he got a medical scholarship at the age of 46, according to his daughter, Lale Bakhtiar, to study medicine there. He's now in his 50s. He meets a young nurse, in her 21-year-old nurse from Idaho, and he marries her. That's Bakhtiar's mother. They have 7 children together, and then he moves them over to Iran, which is the Shah's Iran at this time. And on the eve of World War II, the mother is abandoned. The father is around 77 at this point. He abandons his family, and they end up having to leave to go back to war-torn America, which is basically in the middle of a war. He does keep the 2 sons, because from his beliefs and his cultures, he believes that the boys should remain with him. He also keeps the 2 girls, 2 eldest daughters, who are at the point of getting married, and the rest of the children, the rest of the daughters, are sent back to the States. Lale Bakhtiar later finds out that her father's abandonment had been for the purpose of remarrying. Her mother ended up as a co-wife because the father remarried a teen girl. He was in his 70s at this point. He marries a teen girl from a local Bakhtiari tribe, and he fathers another 10 children at this point. Bakhtiar, she watches her mother raising these 7 children in America as a single mom during World War II. And it's amazing because she does not mention any of the difficulties. She mentions how she has had a very happy childhood. Her 2 brothers are, as I mentioned, kept by her father, and it's only the girls that are abandoned. So this is a snapshot of the beginning of her life. Amazingly, we find that Bakhtiar, she writes very, very fondly about her father. The picture at the top that you can see this is of her father. She's actually written a book about what an amazing man he was. Even though she really barely got to know him, and what she does know of him is that she was abandoned by him, this never comes up. Lale herself, then history kind of repeats itself because she goes on to marry an Iranian man in America. He also moves her back to Iran. And whilst they are there on the eve of the Iranian Revolution, he decides to divorce her and to take off back to America. And she's left penniless, and she ends up staying there for another 16 years, trying to make ends meet through doing translation work. And she lives in Khomeini's Iran, so altogether she's there for 16 years, and 7 of those years are in Khomeini's Iran. And then, sadly, history repeats itself a 3rd time, where her daughter, also who is at this point in the States, gets married to an Iranian man. She goes back to Iran, and this is during a similar time. And when she decides that she's in an abusive marriage and she wants to get out of this marriage, her husband refuses her a divorce, and according to Iranian law, she cannot leave the country, and she cannot get a divorce because she's considered. So she literally is smuggled out of the country and can never return back again. So these are some of the experiences. Now, this is through a lot of archival digging that we find this out, because when you look at her own autobiographical information, she mentions how she's had a very happy life. All the men in her life were very good to her. How her father was an amazing man who, who saved people's lives as a physician, and nothing else is mentioned. There is obviously the trauma with regards to, what they went through during two wars, during the war and then the revolution, and all of what took place through all of that. This takes us then to the trauma theory and understanding what is said with regards to trauma theory when translation is done. So a flood of scholarship in the 90s arose to examine the concepts of trauma and its role in literature and society, most prominently by Kathy Karoth and Shoshana Feldman. They speak about how, trauma is something that one cannot speak about, and it creates a silence, etc. This is then challenged later on by the pluralistic trauma theory model, where one looks at, and the scholars after that, they speak about how this unspeakable trope with regards to trauma is perhaps not the only way to view things. And it suggests that traumatic experience uncovers new relationships between language and knowledge and the way the world is identified. So in this model, trauma is conceptualized as an event that alters one's perception and the identity. And in the wake of this, new perception of oneself and the way they view things is then put together. The majority of discussions that have developed in this field invariably focus on the complex mechanisms surrounding translators as survivor testimonies. But what I'm going to speak about is how the trauma subjects, when they themselves take up the mantle of the translator, and you have the traumatized translator, how does that impact the translation that comes about? What is significant in this study is therefore that when you look at sacred texts, and that is texts that are considered by the adherents of faith to be a revelation from God, and then the translator may have been traumatized in one way or the other, we find some of those who have looked at traumatized translators of non-sacred texts, they mention, how does the translator who is a trauma subject themselves, how does it impact their memory, their experience, and their recovery? And what they mention is that if the translator departs from the source text in the sense of its literality, which is what we find, as well as is trying to translate the pure language, but ends up interpreting it based on their own views and the differences in the way they've understood it, then this is something that becomes cathartic and a way of dealing with things. And I'll give a few examples to just clarify what we're saying. So one example is the very common phrase that is in the Qur'an, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Here, I've taken it from Surah 2, verse 82, but it's dotted all over the Qur'an, some over 84 times. So this is something that you find everywhere. You find that Bakhtiyar, she translates وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ as those who did as the ones in accord with morality. They will be the companions of the garden. They are the ones who will dwell in it forever. Now, it's very interesting because when she speaks about her father, his name is Abul Qasim, and she's written this book, as you can see the picture of it, Abul Qasim of Thus, The Epic Journey of Abul Qasim Bakhtiyar. It's a book written by her, and it can be found on Amazon. She mentions about how he was somebody who didn't pray, didn't fast, and she doesn't highlight that, but it comes out through other parts of his life, that he was addicted to opium, he was an alcoholic as well, and his granddaughters write about this in their own works, and in their own, they've published their own works as well. So it comes out that he was actually somebody who, and he didn't really identify himself as a Muslim. He himself, when he died, he said he wanted his ashes to be sprinkled near the shrine of this Persian, somebody who was worshipped in this ancient Persian religion, and he himself had memorized the Shahnameh as opposed to the Quran. He was not familiar with the Quran, etc. But she's very, very keen to translate and to separate Amal al-Salihat from the traditional acts of worship or good deeds or anything. If you look to the translations, if you go to any website that mentions all the different translations, it's generally translated as good deeds, righteous deeds, and different synonyms along that. But here she has something where she's mentioning in accord with morality. Now, this is something that's interesting specifically because she goes out of her way to mention how her father was a very moral man, that even though he didn't pray, he lived in accord with morality. And this is where the trauma comes in of when you want to believe, there's the trauma bonding of wanting to believe that the person that you may have had a negative relationship with is actually was actually a very good person and a very positive person, and you want to believe that good will happen to them and they're going to go to paradise. This is very subjective, of course, and it's important to recognize that there is subjectivity in this, but it's also important to recognize the possibilities that are there. And this is one example of many examples that we can find in her translation and in other translations that I'm working on, where there is a belief system that is impacted by this trauma. There is this disassociation with how everybody else may view an individual, because they have been victimized to a trauma that is there. And then reading the text through that lens and seeing it in a particular way. When Bakhtiyar mentions that it's free of any type of ideology, it seems very likely that she does not see this as a form, that she is changing the meaning. But this is the way she has read it. And we mentioned about how you are a reader first, and then you are a rewriter of the text. So rather than mentioning that for people to go to paradise, you have to have belief and you have to have righteous good deeds, which are normally understood as ritual good deeds, the prayer, the fasting, the hajj, etc. Instead of that, you now have a situation where it is making it possible for her to be at peace with where she hopes her father would be. And another example is with regards to polygamy. This is something that we find that Bakhtiyar's own children and nieces in particular mention about how she had a very negative experience based on the fact that when her mother was nursing and taking care of all of these children in America during the Second World War, she was there for a period of 6 years. When she returns back to Iran to meet up with her husband, she finds that he has married somebody who is 15 to 20 years her own junior, 50 to 60 years her husband's junior, and he's in the process of building his new family, and he has 10 more children with this Bakhtiyari girl. So she finds that she is a co-wife without ever having had any knowledge of this. And Bakhtiyar is, again, she does not recognize this in her autobiography, but it can be seen from her relatives' autobiographies that what happens. But it's interesting that when you read this translation, that she mentions here that it says, and if you feared that you will not act justly with the orphans, then marry who seems good to you of the women who have orphans, by 2s and 3s or 4s. But if you feared that you will not be just, then 1. Now here, the ayah, that the part of the ayah that I've underlined, it says فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ. It's just saying those who are, seem good to you of the women, okay, in 2s and 3s and 4s. And it doesn't mention of the women who have orphans, because if they're women who have orphans, they themselves are obviously widows. So she is making this very, very tightening it, so to speak, to be inclusive only of widows and not to be of anybody else, almost kind of nullifying her father's other marriage and her other siblings, whom she never actually wanted to know, or she never recognized as her siblings. She always mentions that she only had these 7 siblings and she didn't have anybody else. She doesn't recognize them as legitimate siblings. So again, now what makes this not just an interpretation is because Bakhtiyar goes out of her way to mention that she has not added any words into her translation unless she has made it very clear that it's not from the Arabic. These are some of her comments with regards to her methodology. She says, words not appearing in the Arabic, but necessary for understanding in English, have been put in italics to emphasize the intent of the Quran. Okay, so she says anything that was not in the Arabic, I put it in italics. But when you look at her translation, none of that is in italics. So she's saying that this is actually the exact word-to-word translation of the Arabic, the women who have orphans, and that's not clearly in the Arabic. She also mentions when she was compiling her concordance that my translation is based on my concordance, which in turn is based on my literal translation of the Mu'jam al-Muhtahris li Alfaz al-Quran al-Kareem by Abdul Baqi. This is to remove any bias. Now, when you look to her preface, she mentions that the methodology that she used is she took out all the words from the Quran and then she put them in alphabetical order. And she checked this with all the words that were in Abdul Baqi's Al-Mu'jam al-Mufaharis. and she translates each one. So she decontextualizes the words. And she says she does this intentionally because she says the context will create bias. So I've taken them out and I've decontextualized the words, and then I put the meanings in, and then I look at the ayahs and I string those words that I've previously put together and make my translation. She also says, this is a literal translation. This is a literal translation. I started with translating the words first in alphabetical order, then entered the words into the verses. So this makes it that much more, and take it back. My thing's stuck again. Hold on. Yeah, this makes it that much more noticeable when you look to her translation that she is adding words. For example, here when she says in accord with morality. And when you look to her concordance, it's very clear that she literally just says, she'll put the word amal, abila, and she'll put the root, and she will put next to it those who accord with morality. Okay. And amila is just to do. So by saying she has put together a concordance first, it makes it seem like, oh, well, you know, this has to be very accurate. And if you check back in her concordance, it's accurate according to the concordance. But if you are able to write your own dictionary, so to speak, like literally write your own dictionary, then it's very easy for this to come through. I'll give an example of when she does actually use her methodology. So you can see here when she says, وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْذِبُونَ. And for them is a painful punishment because they had been lying against themselves. So she puts is in italics because she says there's no is in the Quran. So every time she puts is, she's showing how precise she is that, oh, I added an is here. And she says, I added against themselves because it's not there in the Arabic. When she says, summun bukmun umyun fahum la yarji'un, she says, unwilling to hear, unwilling to speak, unwilling to see, then they will not return to, and she says that it doesn't say the way. So I put the in italics. So she makes it very clear that she's not adding any of the words that are not in the Arabic. But then when you come to words like this, she's got a whole sentence. And unfortunately, this has come as if I've written the whole thing in italics, but the whole translation is not in italics of this ayah. So here, this is what I was quoting earlier on Mackenzie's work when she writes about trauma and translation in Robert Greaves' The Anger of Achilles. Here she mentions about when the translator is also a trauma subject, that his experience of, in this situation, her experience, his experience of recovery, if the translator departs from the source text in the sense of literality, if he translates not the form and the meaning of the original words, but the text's deeper truth as he or she interprets it, in essence, the translation shifts from a reflective mode to a cathartic act in which the target text becomes involved in the translator's attempts to perceive and understand his or her own history, disrupted as it is by trauma and defragmenting the self. So here again, we can see how there is this tug of war that's going on when the translator is also a trauma subject. So when we look at comments like this of Bakhtiyar's, which she mentions in her preface, that my translation is free from any transient denominational or doctrinal bias, it is the most objective type of translation. Although at the beginning, one can feel like, oh, well, you know, this was trying to fool the people. Once you look at it through the lens of trauma theory, you can perhaps conclude that there is another type of ideology, which is the subconscious or unconscious ideology, the implicit ideology, the one that the translator herself does not recognize. And that is included because of their personal reading of the text. Now, this is important because this is not something that's, although I've given examples from the Sublime Quran and Lale Bakhtiyar, this is not something that's specific to her. This trauma may be specific to her, but we all have life's contexts. We have all lived through different experiences that impact the way that we see it. We have family situations, we have marital situations, we have things that we see that are going on the news. And it impacts our worldview, it impacts how we see things, it impacts how we read things. And this is all part of the reading and then the rewriting that sometimes the translator will implicitly look at and not recognize when they are interpreting the text. And they may come up with many different ways to mitigate what they consider to be ideology. You can see that she has tried to, use a dictionary and to separate the words, to decontextualize the words, which of course has created a whole host of other problems when you decontextualize words from their meaning. But you can see there is an effort there to be able to separate it, and yet it is still entering into the translation. So what I'm working on is building this model that can then be used with every translation, where I believe, and what I'm arguing for, is that really every translation should have biographical information regarding the translator. If I take it back to where we had the different contexts that impact the Quran translator's choices, or any translator's choices for that matter, whether, where we can understand a little bit more about their cultural context, their academic genealogy, their ideological positionality, the theological leanings, their methodological choices, their personal context, so that when one is reading a translation, it's not just, okay, well, this is the exact meanings of the words of the Quran, or for those who believe the meanings of the words of God, but rather to be able to contextualize the lens through which that translator read those words, and the only lens through which they are then able to be able to rewrite those words. So that's really, I think my time is up. I can see Mykhaylo back on the screen. So that's really what I'm working on at the moment, and I look forward to any discussion or questions.
Thank you so much, dear Sheam, for that insightful presentation. And now